Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to our discussion. This is NCL and CompTIA coming to you live. I am David Zeichick, and we are in for quite a treat here for a discussion with James Stanger. And here is like the overview. So we're going to talk a little bit about our partnership. That's the NCL and CompTIA partnership. And then we're going to rush right into the discussion because we do have James with us who brings a wealth of information. So a little bit about James on the next slide. So James is, his official title, the Chief Technology Evangelist for CompTIA. He leads CompTIA's research on trends within the IT workforce and consults with organizations worldwide, including Microsoft, Northrop Grumman, the US Department of State, and NIST. So he's here today to share his insights on how you can help prepare your students to enter the workforce, which is what we want to do. I mean, that's, as a professor here, and I'm sure all the others on the call who are also teachers, that's our goal, is prepare our students for the workforce. And James is going to offer, I think, some great insight on how to do that. So James, why don't I let you take it away for a moment, maybe fill in some of the gaps about yourself, and then a little bit about, we'll talk about CompTIA.
Sure. Greetings, everybody. I'm Chief Technology Evangelist at CompTIA, and usually people ask, well, what the heck is that? So my job is to build consensus, really. The evangelist job role kind of came out of the developer community. So as developers created a platform, as companies did, whatever platform you can think of, from say Java or JavaScript or frameworks, things, they always needed evangelists to kind of get the word out there. So I get the word out there, not so much about CompTIA's platforms or CompTIA's training or even certifications, but what we do in the industry. We help provide people with evidence of skills that they've gotten from you as the professors. So my history, I started out, I always tell people I got a PhD back in 1997. It was my PhD in unemployment. With PhD in English literature, British Romantic literature. I always tell people I've helped create certifications and badging programs and things from British Romantic literature to kayaking for the Boy Scouts of America years ago, to security analytics, web technologies, Linux, etc. So I've done a lot of work in there. Back in 1997 is when I kind of made a shift over from the academic world into industry and worked with various organizations. And it's been fun to do that. At CompTIA, it was great to land with CompTIA here. Golly, I think it's been about 10 years ago now. Working with people worldwide. It's exciting to talk to hiring managers, for example. It's exciting to talk to students. Just yesterday, I talked to a cohort of students that were graduating. I gave a keynote for them, and it was really neat to see them moving and making that transition, that phase from pure learning, as it were, right, into learning about the job market and how to go into and get hired. It's also exciting. I do corporate roundtables around the world. For example, with Security Operations Center learners that was in Thailand and India, in Nashville, and in Manhattan. I worked with CIOs and CISOs discussing their employment needs. So I don't just read research that CompTIA comes out with, which is great stuff, by the way, but I actually go in and talk to the very people who generate that. So I'm excited to be here today.
Great, thanks. So yeah, on the next slide, let's talk a little bit about the CompTIA certifications.
So when it comes to CompTIA certifications, what we've done, forgive me if I put my glasses on, I'm half blind without. When it comes to CompTIA certifications, starting in the 80s, we were told by our CompTIA membership. And our membership can be companies as small as managed service providers, all the way up to huge companies such as Dell or Ricoh, others, just huge multinationals. So we run the gamut. And we listen very carefully to what these folks tell us. And starting in the 80s and continuing on, they said, hey, let's focus on education, because the main thing that we see, and this is the industry talking, are people who are constantly lacking certain skills. And I sound like Liam Neeson there, but they're lacking various skills. And so we kind of went in there and we've created pathways. And you can see these pathways. There's the infrastructure pathway, for example, the cybersecurity pathway. We have the data pathway. That's relatively new. That's not even on this particular screen. So we basically provide education opportunities, whether it be as a professor, for example, as you're teaching a topic, whether it be endpoints. A plus to me is all about endpoints when it comes to security, right? Network is how you network those endpoints together. Security plus the gateway to the rest of security. So we have been providing these certifications for years. We now have a lot of training programs. We have content. We have labs, hands-on practice labs, things like that. So we provide kind of the gamut, as it were, whether it be proving certification, but also getting that hands-on experience that employers are looking for. So thanks, David.
Yeah, sure. And so, yeah, to segue into how does the NCL play into all of this? Well, James, I'm sure you're probably going to get into certifications and using those for employees. Sure. And what we do with the NCL side is prep with hands-on skills for students to go ahead and pass those certifications. The NCL categories are mapped to the CompTIA certs. And of course, that's going to then help your students prepare for each of those certification exams. So that is one part of the partnership. When you are participating, or when your students are participating in the NCL, they'll earn the CEUs for playing in the NCL, and maybe you can hit upon that in a moment.
Sure, man.
And then we also got great swag and prizes that CompTIA has been generous enough to donate to the NCL and to the players. So I think this is a great partnership. It's, they're getting the hands-on skills preparing for the certs, and the certs are help preparing them for industry. So I think this is great.
No, it's great. It's a fantastic partnership because it's allowed us at CompTIA to do several things that are really central to our mission as an education company. Right. The first thing is it helps us engage with instructors. It helps us engage with the very students. For example, David, Franz and I have been able to talk with people. I've been able to work with quite a few folks from the NCL side in addressing and talking to students who are so excited to prove their hands-on knowledge. And it was the NCL partnership that was really attractive to us, was getting students to think in a practical, hands-on way. That's my favorite phrase: practical and hands-on. It's if you're, there are a couple of things. If you're not doing these things hands-on, when I say these things, you can learn about the TCP handshake, right? Or you can learn about man in the middle attacks or person in the middle attacks, right? You can learn about those things as abstract concepts, or you can actually learn about do them, right? So the first thing is, if you haven't implemented that abstract concept, taken that kind of acronym, alphabet stew, and actually gone in and made it real, then it's not going to be real. And so with NCL, it really makes that possible. I think the other thing is, other insight, at least I think I have in that, is, I can't remember who it was. Was it Feynman, Richard Feynman, who said, if you're not teaching something, then you haven't really learned it. I think he was a person who kind of coined that term, right? Mm-hmm. What's cool, David, is when it comes to the NCL, it allows not only instructors, but students to teach each other, right? So it's that peer-based learning. In addition to the hands-on, the peer-based learning. It's so cool because that way students who may have done some hands-on things, but really don't know what it means to interact with somebody, especially with COVID having happened and all that. It's really neat to see how NCL really allowed us to keep that human interaction going. So between hands-on and human interaction, it's what it's all about for us. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're hinting on about like the team game portion of the NCL, where the teams are working together. Yeah, which I'm sure hopefully you'll hit on that as well, about the importance of working as a team. So let's kind of give you the overview of what we're going to talk about. So we have divided our precious time up into 3 different chunks. So the first part is we're going to ask James about what are the trends in entry-level cyber jobs, apprenticeships, and internships. Then we'll move on to what skills are employers looking for, right? Definitely a hot topic because students always want to know that. And then, of course, how can educators, how us, help their students demonstrate their skills to employees? So those are kind of the big topics that we're going to talk about. And we do encourage you to put any questions that you have in the chat. And while you're at it, if you could right now put in the chat the name of the school or organization that you're with, and that will just kind of better help us understand who's on the call and how to address the questions, then also to be able to address your school and your question. So, James, why don't we jump right into the first one? What are the trends in entry-level cyber jobs, apprenticeships, and internships?
I think one of the first trends is that we're all being replaced by Chat GPT. Sorry,
sure. Yes.
That seems to be one of the topics, right? Other trends have to do with, wait a minute, we're hearing about nothing but layoffs, right? And downturn and all that. I mean, I think these are some of the things that people think about, at least right now. And thanks for asking folks, David, about where they're going in from. We've got Pamela from City Colleges and Dustin from Portland. Hey, Mount Hood. We were just talking, David and I, about. David, you got family up in Portland, don't you?
I do. Exactly. Up in the Woodstock area. Yep.
And you were just walking
Multnomah.
Right? So
yep. Beautiful spot.
Hey, George, you're from Chaffee College. I know that place. And Mount Aloysius. How you doing, Justin? So good to have you all join in. So a couple of trends to think about in regards to cyber jobs and apprenticeships. One thing that I suppose we could start with is talking about apprenticeships and internships and their importance. You want to talk about that, David, for example? We do a lot of work at CompTIA worldwide concerning apprenticeships. And I'm thinking, for example, in terms of work that, for example, Amy Cardell, who works for CompTIA, she does a tremendous amount of that worldwide. She focuses a lot on the U.S. In fact, she's a Californian like yourself. She lives down, golly, I want to say Monterey. Is that about right? Kind of down that way.
Nice area. Yeah.
What we're seeing is that organizations in the U.S. have been slower to pick up on apprenticeships and traditionally anyway, and internships than, say, Europe, who does really quite well with them, especially in the U.K. We've seen a lot of work there. But the thing that I think we can couch this in, this discussion of the importance of apprenticeships, is that organizations, they really are interested in risk management. And I don't mean risk management just in terms of as a pure security thing. I think it's all about managing the risk of hiring somebody. You know, David, if you're hiring me, right, if this is a job interview, isn't what you're doing, you know, one of the things that you're looking to do is to manage the risk of hiring me. Is James a good risk, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I think apprenticeships can help figure out that risk management element, because that way organizations aren't just coming in with somebody cold off the street. They can shape that person however they want to do. And they can also do it in some really interesting ways. Apprenticeships do some really interesting things because instead of looking to the same old network of people, which tends not to be particularly diverse, you can bring in a much different and more neurodiverse or ethnically diverse diversity in terms of gender to bring in. And that's one of the things that we're seeing, the impact of internships and apprenticeships, is that it's bringing an entirely new, different types of people. And I realize I just engaged in subject-verb disagreement there, but I meant to, because it just brings in, and organizations are realizing that they can't just keep looking at the same circle of availability, because then you're doing things like you're just stealing talent from one thing to the other, from one company to the other. You're not really building a culture there that's important. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing that apprenticeships are doing, not only in terms of diversity, it's helping those peer-based kind of discussions to take place. Because now, as an apprentice comes in or as an intern comes in, you've got the opportunity for knowledge transfer to happen, whether it be between a certain demographic and another demographic, or gender in terms of other things. It really engages in a lot of barrier breaking types of activities. We're seeing a lot of organizations being very interested in doing serious apprenticeships, whether it be CVS pharmacy, for example, a lot of banks, for example. So it's been neat to see that.
Right. Yeah. And speaking about like internships and apprenticeships specifically from like cybersecurity, it seems to me like the company needs to, evaluate their risk of taking someone on
Yeah.
into something that could be so sensitive as cybersecurity, where I've seen in the past where, companies aren't really willing to do that. But now I'm hearing of like companies hiring high school students even into cybersecurity internships and apprenticeships. So there's some sort of trend here happening that I don't know what's allowing these companies to do this. Maybe it's the need. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Why are we seeing this turnaround?
I'm glad you brought that up. I think there's a big time kind of discussion that's traditionally happened. Like, if I bring somebody on, who's so young, do they really understand the importance of the things that they're securing and all that? And they weigh that with, well, we don't have anybody in there right now, right?
Okay, yeah.
The risk of having that, and the risk of bringing somebody on who might be more senior, but then suddenly they take off, right? So it's this apprenticeships I see as a better way to engage the workforce in a more creative way. And so it actually, as you bring in people who are younger, as you bring in people, it actually lowers the risk that the real cybersecurity risk, because then you're actually able to bring somebody on. You're actually to bring them in and train them. Organizations, especially in the U.S., in my opinion, many of them have been, I'm being awfully broad here, but there are a lot of organizations out there who've never seen the importance of upskilling until recently. Okay. They just kind of feel, well, we'll just go out and get somebody good. And then they go out there and realize, oh, there are several different reasons why that's not possible, right? Or not practical. Right. And so, but really, as part of that kind of risk management process of hiring somebody, I think the question becomes, so what are some of the things that the hiring managers are looking for to lower that risk? Okay, or some of the things they're looking for. And it could be, I think it's probably time then that we could talk about, for example, what hiring managers seem to be running into constantly, whether it be with 30-somethings, 40-somethings, or 20-somethings, in terms of the skill sets that folks are bringing to the table. I was talking to a friend of mine. His name is Mike Garrity. You can look him up. He's the CISO for the state of New Jersey. Okay, so he does a lot of he hires a lot of people. He has responsibility for not only liaising with the FBI, with various organizations around the world. He's a major liaison there, but he also has responsibility of working with the cities and towns throughout New Jersey, school districts, things like that, and helping them fight issues such as ransomware, things like that. And he has stated to me the same thing that a gentleman over in NCSA Thailand, Amorn Chakrabarti, that's his name. Amorn, he lives in Thailand. He says the same thing as Mike Garrity, and they're all saying the same thing as a CISO that I know in the UK, whose name is Chris Hodson, and they're all saying this, that we still keep coming in, bringing in not only students, not just 20-somethings, but everybody who don't have a lot of the foundational knowledge that they need to succeed. And when I say foundational knowledge, I'm talking about the TCP handshake. I think I mentioned that earlier, or understanding how TLS works, SSL TLS, right? We use TLS, right? And understanding some of those issues. And I think it was Mike, he used the term, the phrase, you can't secure a network unless you know how the networks work, right? And so there's that. So I think there are reasons for this, right? Because it's not like professors haven't been teaching this. It's not like learning centers haven't been teaching it. Gosh, that's been in CompTIA's education programs for decades, things like the foundations of DNS and all that. But when you look at the trend of things like ransomware, social engineering, and you look at the announcements that the U.S. government has regularly put out, that the Five Eyes, whether it be UK, Australia, New Zealand, all those outfits, all those governments, putting out the point that, hey, you need to get your DNS ducks in a row. If you want to start with security and move on to cool things like zero trust or whatever, let's start with the fundamentals. Do your people know DNS? Do they know how DHCP can be messed around with, right? From social engineering. It's those kind of trends that I see across the board. It's not just a US problem, not a Canada problem. It's something that's around the world. And it's just knowing those foundations is really important.
And so kind of going back to CompTIA a little bit then, so passing some of those certifications will show that they know that information. And then obviously to pass those certifications, then they need to study up on those fundamentals that you're talking about. So we're kind of getting to the analytical and the idea piece behind security. And then we kind of move on to the hands-on piece. So yeah, you're talking about having both of those together, right?
You got to have them both. And it's funny that it's a good point you bring up, the idea about the analytical side of things. Some of the trends that we're seeing, for example, is an increase in wanting to understand what it means to monitor bad behavior, right? Or even monitor good behavior. But the monitoring and analytics, there's no magic bullet when it comes to security. We all know this, right? But one of the things that we're seeing, whether it be about ransomware, which continues to be a problem, and the healthcare industry continues to have serious problems with that. So does manufacturing. It may not make the news as much because organizations are very clever, in a good way, usually, about how to disclose those things, right? There's also been a lot of disclosure fatigue over the last few years. Do you remember 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the latest news, there were 5,000 people or 250,000 people. Have you noticed that talk has gone away?
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. We've just heard too much of it. And it's like, well, what company hasn't announced this yet?
That's it.
Yeah.
The question becomes, how can organizations mature their behavior? Apprenticeship can be part of that. Getting hands-on knowledge, all those, it can be part of their behavior. But I think that we still are seeing major attacks. And let's talk about trends for a second. So we're still seeing major ransomware, obviously social engineering, right? There's two of them, right? We're still seeing the advanced persistent threat, which is it doesn't announce itself, right? The threat actor, usually state-sponsored, or at least traditionally state-sponsored. There are a lot of non-state sponsored people who can do very, very good activities these days because there's so much good, I shouldn't say good, but so much effective code lying around. They can just use it. So you have the APT as well. That becomes a big issue. We're seeing huge problems with denial of service attacks, distributed denial of service attacks. Why are we seeing these issues? Because I still think organizations still aren't getting their ducks in a row in terms of foundations, DNS, all that. But I also think when it comes to DDoS attacks, remember, we're still dealing with protocols that were designed to make things happen and connect, right? And they weren't designed to thwart the idea of people maliciously misusing them, right?
Right.
To me, I like to see, I don't like to see it, but I tend to see DDoS attacks as kind of the autoimmune deficiency problem of the internet. In other words, it's the bad actors are using the internet against itself, and things are behaving as they expected, and yet they can be manipulated into doing bad things. It's kind of akin to social engineering in a sense.
Right.
Those are major trends that we continue to see worldwide. So I thought I'd throw that out there, David.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And like, as we all know, like the internet wasn't built to withstand any of this or process, sensitive information. So it was designed to be open and easily transferable of data. And of course, that's where the bad guys have figured out, how they can leverage those vulnerabilities.
David, there was a question here. I think it was is it from MH? How you doing, MH from Kansas? Asking about things such as, what is the future of cybersecurity like with quantum computing on the rise? So quantum cryptography, right, becomes an issue. This goes back to a lot of the fundamental things that people need to learn. And MH, I'm glad you brought this up because to be honest, it allows us to go back to some root causes of why this is happening. And more than just dishonesty or the fact that there are gangs or Ukraine or whatever, it comes back to things such as democratization of IT, right? 20 years ago, the things that we are using every day were completely fundamentally unavailable. I mean, David, remember 20 years ago, if it's, hey, let's get a web server going. Well, you had to find a room and an internet connection and had to cool the room because servers are great space heaters and all that. Well, 10 years ago, you went to a data center for that. So it abstracted out, it, virtualized out some of those things. Now we've got the cloud. But my point is, with quantum computing, it's available now. It's not just localized to a huge government or some huge research institution. We have capability for that right now. And I say we, you and I can go out and grab a lot of that. Okay. So when it comes to democratization of IT, when the commodification of things, miniaturization, all those fundamental elements, it's hard to talk about quantum computing unless you show that inexorable kind of movement towards virtualization, towards abstraction, towards democratization, things like that. So the future of computing, first of all, we're going to have to take a look at our encryption, because our encryption is majorly going to form under attack. And as those things, when I say those things, quantum computing becomes available to the masses, do you think that they're going to become botnetted? Do you think that, and not just attacked by botnets, but I mean that, that capability, huge, terabytes, petabytes of power are going to be thrown at trying to break encryption. So we're going to see a problem there. The problem we'll also see, how to solve that. Believe it or not, two-factor authentication will remain important. And there's still a lot of organizations that aren't using two-factor authentication. So one of the futures is going to be more and more commodified and effective forms of authentication and encryption. So I think when it comes to that, and I also bringing up the idea of, and I don't know if RSA was hacked. That's a good question. And when you say RSA, I assume you're not talking about RSA San Francisco. You're talking about the company, the algorithms that are securing this very conversation, possibly, right? I suppose it is a bit frightening to see whether or not they got attacked. More frightening, I suppose, would be if they did. Why wasn't it? Who was it? Who was that? I should say, who was that divulged to? How was that communicated? So another thing, just one final thing about quantum computing, and it has to do with the cloud. I think I was talking to a guy named Robert Vanier. He works for a company called AstraZeneca. David, I don't know if you did the AstraZeneca vaccine or whatever. I did Moderna.
Right. Yeah, me too.
But he is over the cloud and data center implementations for all of AstraZeneca. And they see themselves more as a tech company in a sense than just a pharmaceutical company. In other words, they see themselves actually as a company that solves problems with data rather than as a tech or even a pharmaceutical company. My point is that he said, if you look up and see what's happening with the cloud, he said the changes up there are radical and fundamental every 3 weeks. Now, think about that, David. Does that have to do with quantum computing? It does a little bit. But think about that. Remember how we always have misused Moore's Law, right? Moore's Law is what? CPU power increases, doubles every 18 months. Am I getting that right?
Yep, right about there.
People usually misuse that and saying technology changes every 18 months. Have you ever noticed how that kind of...
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right? And there's a certain amount of correlation there, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking 3 weeks now, right? And I guess that goes back to my point that if things are radically changing in a vendor's implementation, when I say a vendor, AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, name it, right? IBM, whatever, Alibaba, if you're international. If things are changing that radically, then you need to have your foundational skills to keep your feet. If you don't have that, you're just going to get lost. And last time I was up, I did some cloud migration for an organization, and I noticed right away that things were done. I didn't have to go out and log into a server, right? Because it was all done via web pages, right? And I had to click things. But I still had to have the knowledge about, okay, what IP address range are you opening up to the world? Well, if you don't know what an IP address range is, a vendor's not going to teach you that. If you don't know about MAC address, limiting, using MAC addresses for limiting, or understanding things in terms of zero trust, if they're going to do certificate pinning with zero trust to enable application-specific monitoring and analytics at the level of a TLS certificate, if you don't know those elements, you're not going to be able to put together a business solution. So
Yeah. So you're talking about like historical. I'm also thinking about like the whole concept of what I'm teaching now might not apply to the future. So I need to figure out how to teach to the future a little bit. And I think that kind of comes back to the question about quantum computing is
good point.
right now, maybe we don't see it being used, but when students graduate, what do you think they'll need to know about quantum computing in relation to cybersecurity? And in addition to that, are you seeing anything asked by employers looking for people with quantum computing knowledge?
A lot of the folks that are going to be asking about quantum computing that I know are going to be folks working, for example, for the NSA. That's certainly an area that they're going to be interested in. At CompTIA, we work a lot with folks in the federal government. That's an example. You see a lot of research institutions doing that, and you'll see a lot of larger corporations doing that still right now. But after a while, it will be how to defend yourself against folks who get a hold of quantum computing and things like that.
Right.
And you can't talk about things like quantum computing, whether it be parallel, computing and grid computing and all that, unless you really understand the elements of what it means to put together, whatever endpoint. I'm just showing my mobile phone here. It starts with understanding all of those elements, and then I can't remember who it was. It was CryptoKate over at NCSL. She used to love to tell a great story on herself about, because she knows a tremendous amount about cryptography and things like that. But at some point, long time ago, early in her career, she was saying she was asked to log in to a certain system, and she couldn't figure out how to log into it. She's like, "Oh my gosh, it's those gaps that can always cause annoying problems or even larger problems." So.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So maybe you had mentioned ChatGPT earlier on, so maybe we can kind of add that into the mix here as well. How is that? How can we incorporate that into as a tool that we use to teach our students cybersecurity? Have you been thinking about that at all?
Great question. I think that when it comes to AI and ML, and I tend to talk about it in terms of machine language more than AI. There's a really lame joke, and I'll make it quick. What language do you use for machine learning, David? What are some of the languages? Things like Python,
Python, yeah,
and things like that, right? Do you know what language you use for AI? PowerPoint slides, right?
Sure.
I think it's smart Alec, right? Sorry about that. But,
yeah, that's great. Mm-hmm. But
it's
definitely being something that now, general mainstream public,
absolutely.
you ask people on the street, they know ChatGPT, and some people are using it every day. Yeah.
Captured the imagination of the world. And I think one reason why it did it is that too often AI, ML, however you want to talk about it, is always seen as some sort of invasive thing or extremely foreign thing. It's a dated reference. Arnold Schwarzenegger coming along to terminate you and your job or something, right? I think the first thing to talk about AI, one way to tame that anxiety, there are a couple of root causes here. First of all, I still think that even technologists tend to treat technology as some sort of mystery box, mystery thing. We don't know exactly what's being automated. Think about that for a second. Also, with ChatGPT, that was a very clever move, because what it does is it takes a very traditional old AI ML implementation, and what did it do? It gave it a human kind of interface. It made it interactive. So it's not the Terminator anymore. You know what I mean? It's not "I'll be back" or "I'll be here to get your job" or whatever. It's "How can I help you today?" Right?
Yeah.
Where do you want to go today? It's almost, to me, I see it as, when I see the ChatGPT interface, I can't help but think of the Windows 95, start me up, where do you want to go today kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm noticing more of my students are turning, not to Google, but to ChatGPT now to ask questions, especially on some of my computer security assignments. They'll go and figure out, well, what is the T-shark command to do this? And it returns that beautifully. So I'm encouraging that as a tool to figure out how to do things.
First of all, we have to learn to work and play well with all of our workers, and AI and ML has been a co-worker for us for a long time. For example, I was just off a call with Red Hat. They have something they call it the Wisdom Project, and many of us on the call know about Ansible, about how to use Ansible to automate things. Using a code line about this long or so, you can create you can launch 1,000 containers, or you can do orchestration, or you can create a playbook to do an update of 1,000 servers or whatever, right? That's Ansible. Well, what they're doing with this Wisdom project, for example, is they're adding an AI component to that. So the way to tame, I think, that anxiety about tech as a black box is, first of all, to bring in, it's not a mystery anymore, right? We know what's going on with AI and ML. It's a predictive engine. It's a modification engine. It can modify itself. But I think it's also important to look at in terms of automation, fancy automation. So ChatGPT is a great coworker. And what I've been noticing is I remember at RSA San Francisco here, it was probably 5 years ago, AI was the big talk, right? There's always the big, theme that goes on in these conferences. And the message that I got, even then, that was 5 years ago, was folks have been working with AI a lot longer than they realize. And it's just that whenever it gets used and implemented, we tend not to see it as AI. Well, that's not futuristic enough, right?
Yeah.
I do find it fascinating that with ChatGPT, a simple text box that allows you to avoid using the Booleans and, but, or, and nor, and all that, where you can just type in a human question, has brought AI to the people's imagination.
Yeah, well, it's returning things that aren't as messy. Like with Google, you have to, weed through the results.
That's
It
right.
just comes right back and tells you exactly what you need to know without weeding through. And of course, you do need to know what is being brought back so you can actually do a little reality check to say, oh yeah, that maybe needs a little tweaking. So
I'm glad you brought that up. If there is a garbage in, garbage out factor that remains, folks.
yeah,
And that's the thing. I think people tend to look at ChatGPT as, oh, that's smart learning, so I can trust the results more. Now, just coming back to you in a slick way, right, in a conversant way, right, doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate. For example, I ego surfed myself when I first got onto ChatGPT just to see, is there any reality there? And I was informed that I was ITIL certified.
Oh,
I'm not. I don't know where that came from. I've spoken about it. I've taught people that I'm not
interesting.
certified or ITIL, whatever you want to call that, right?
Right.
So I'm glad you brought up the evaluation part. And I think that's another thing. A lot of people want to treat technology as something that, well, it's on the internet, so therefore it's authoritative.
Yeah.
Now, I think we've gotten ourselves as a cultures into a lot of trouble with that assumption. I'm a big fan of working with our AI coworkers. Big fan. Me, moving forward, the future in cybersecurity is working with various different types of workers: board members, executive management, AI, log files. These are to me, I see them as just data sets, right? And how can you better evaluate those data sets? I think it's very scary to think that, well, if it's AI, that means we can trust it. No, it's another source of data is how I would look at it.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if will be some certification on how well can you use ChatGPT as a tool, right? Because that's important.
Or any of the AI tools. For example, there's QRadar. There's so many. I'm just mentioning, in a broad way, examples of, for example, security analytics tools, right? Many of them have suggestion functions in them. Similar to, here's a broad example. Whenever we go buy something, right, isn't there always, hey, you bought X, have you thought about Y? People who bought X bought Y and Z and even ABC, right? Well, what do you think came up with that? Right? That was machine learning that came up with that.
Yeah, exactly.
There was nobody working hands-on going, oh boy, David's buying something. That's all. Those are things were primed, and I don't mean that Amazon Prime, but they were primed in a way. And I think that the certifications will focus on issues, for example, on your ability to evaluate. Right now, we still, and I say right now for the next foreseeable future, we still need people who can evaluate and figure out bias, for example, because AI has serious problems. It continues to have serious problems with things such as bias. And you can talk about that in terms of race, class, gender. You can talk about bias just in terms of statistical bias and things, just the way that things are programmed.
So that might be a good segue into kind of the third part segment here, in terms of being able to recognize and vet responses. Frame this in: how can educators help their students demonstrate their skills to their employees? And I know we have one question related to that from Angela, so maybe we can address that one, which is what are the trends for college students needing certifications for entry-level certifications?
The first trend when it comes to anything, and we could talk about it in terms of certification, so I appreciate that question. Employers want evidence of some form of achievement. And that evidence, I think, many years ago, was, say, a college degree or whatever. That has changed. And you could say, well, certification takes that place. I'm not so sure about that. What I am sure about is that hiring managers, to manage that risk, they want some form of real evidence. And I think, for example, of the scouting reports, for example, that NCL brings.
Thanks for bringing that up.
That's evidence, right? It's all about the evidence. Other evidence is, okay, I'm applying to you, David. So you're going to find some sort of way, right, that says, well, James says he did X, Y, and Z, that he did these activities, whether it be incident response, which is a huge topic, a major need right now, or governance, another major need right there. So what is his actual experience there? And so evidence can take place as students are transitioning from the university or college or whatever learning into the workforce. So what are some of the practical ways that they can really show evidence? And to me, certification, things like the NCL scouting reports that are kind of vetted third party, by some sort of third party, and it shows some sort of, very, how should I put it, structured way in which, here are the important topics, here's the unimportant stuff, get rid of that. How can we focus on that? To me, it's all about the evidence.
Right. And so we know that employers now know pretty, they're a little more, I guess, experts now in certifications and knowing, which ones are which. How would you say they are with like competition? So, I'm obviously speaking from the NCL side and the scouting report. Do you see them asking students about, hey, what competitions did you participate in, and how well did you learn, and what did you learn? Those kind of things.
They are. We could start with something as informal as a nephew of mine recently got hired on working for a data center for a huge database company. That's the name of, for Oracle, right? And they asked him, what some experience do you have in this, right? And I'll start with kind of a ridiculous one and get into a more sublime example. But the question, and he at first was kind of flummoxed by he was confused by the question. He's like, I have to show evidence of, I don't have that much experience, right? And what he did is he defaulted and said, my first experience in working with hardware was I took my gaming console and I broke it open and I overclocked the CPU and I put it in the hard. Now, that's not a contest thing. I'll get to that, right?
Okay.
He said before then he could tell the room temperature. People's body language was, like this. And he said he didn't feel he was connecting. But he said as soon as he showed an evidence of, curiosity and how things work, he said it went from people kind of doing this to leaning forward and going, now tell me what you did, right? That changed the top because it showed his curiosity. It showed his engagement. It showed hands-on practical and all that. But see, he didn't have that particular, he got the job, but that conversation would have been so much further ahead in the first 10 minutes of that interview, first 5 minutes of the interview. If he said, look, I engaged in this capture the flag or this activity, and here's some evidence, you could call it, the educational artifact, of it, right? And if you could show things like an NCL report or a scouting report or a certification, it allows that conversation to start at a different level or get to a different level much quicker.
Right. Yeah. And so that's great when they're now at the stage of being able to have the interview and talk to a hiring manager. What if we back up a little bit and talk about, when all those resumes are coming in and maybe are being evaluated by HR? What are they looking for there? We know certs. What else? Like, how?
And before, it's a great point because It doesn't even get evaluated by an HR person. It gets evaluated not even by AI, but by simple scripts that go in and look for keywords.
Yeah.
And they are keyed much more than they were even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, to look for specific certifications. They just are. And so it's not even a human being who will eliminate the wheat from the chaff or whatever, or separate the wheat from the chaff, right? It's those scripts that do that. That's a great point. I don't know, David, if this is too far afield, but I'd like to go even further back from the resume creation, like to get past that initial, how do you want to call it, that initial filter. I think students today need more confidence. They need to feel more confident in themselves. And I don't care if they're homeschooled students like Scott mentions. How you doing, Scott from Arkansas, or Hunter from Utah? I don't know exactly if you're doing homeschool or not, but whether you're working in a community college as a student or whether you're working at a university or homeschool, I think that there's a serious confidence gap out there among learners because they don't quite know where to start on the body of knowledge to become one of these IT workers or security workers.
Right.
Also a confidence gap amongst people hiring. I think things are changing so quickly and moving so quickly, it's hard for them to keep their feet. So I think there's a confidence gap on both sides of the equation. And it's that experiential nature and reporting, data-driven nature of things that's important.
Yep. The whole imposter syndrome is definitely huge, especially in tech. Yeah, because like you said, I think things are changing, and when you get into tech, there's a lot of things you don't know.
And it's interesting. It's always good to be humble, right? But after a while, I always call it humility. The humility, right, comes like you said, imposter syndrome. And I encounter that a lot with people. Case in story, I know of a group of students in Jamaica who have done work as a security operations center. They set up their own security operations center with a partner of ours, and they actually do work for various organizations in Jamaica and also some in Florida, right? And kind of to your point earlier, it's like, well, wait a minute, students doing that? I mean, do the corporations know that the students are doing that? And the answer is, as a resounding yes, they do, because they realize that their security operations center people always need to be learning. And why not grab those students early while they're still capable of learning, right? So that becomes a major issue. And what set those students apart was that they did have evidence of competitions that they were in. They did have evidence of certifications that they had gotten. And that allowed the organizations that they worked for to go, okay, I don't see how this is any different than higher paid folks who, frankly, may not be learning as quickly. So, and I'm not saying the younger people necessarily learn faster. I'm just saying that these students showed an initiative that corporations respect.
Right. Okay. So that might be an important thing. So just to kind of reframe your answer to what can we as educators do to help our students? I think you're listing as some soft skills, right? The confidence.
Great point. Yeah.
And with that confidence is showing that they've competed in competitions and that they've taken it upon themselves to do some certifications. So how do we frame that to help our students in terms of the job search?
I think it has to do with the ability to complete something, right? And the ability to see, in this case, a competition. You could argue that that's kind of a project from beginning, middle to finish, right? And how that works. So it teaches, if you're talking about, say, soft skills or power skills or whatever you want to call them, durable skills, it's do you understand how to bring something to completion? Do you understand something in terms of working in partnership with people? How to deal with conflict, right? I had a student one time got a job and was asked specific questions, and I actually had the student send me those questions, because she actually wrote them down, right, and sent me over like that. And they were specific questions about, well, tell me how a hard disk works, and tell me how from that to how DNS works. And then they asked about things like, okay, tell me about the last time you were in a conflict with somebody. How did you resolve it? They ask those specific kinds of questions. And so, project management, all the way to things like conflict management, very important concepts there. So.
Okay. So that ITIL thing that you don't have.
Yeah. See, now I'm gonna have to go get it just to prove I know what I'm doing there, you know. So I think from an education perspective, when it comes to really helping students, you know, make that transition from a learner to a learner who is now, you know, getting that job. The main thing is to find a way to think like somebody else. And that somebody else in this case is that hiring manager or the organization. And that students to go beyond just, you know, have soft skills, for that student to actually develop an empathy for what that organization wants. If a student can go in, or a person, either through the form of a resume or a cover letter or an interview, for the student to say, well, I'm sensing that the organization might need X and Y. Is that correct? And then if that's correct, then oh my goodness, that's great. But a good hiring person, a good interview will go, well, actually, what we're really interested in is, you know, let's tell you that. And it's the ability to kind of engage in a dialogue. Tech workers, we get a lot of rap for not being able to communicate with folks, or, you know, very linear or whatever like that. I think if you show the ability to get past that rap, then you'll be seen as a good risk.
That's interesting. So do you have any ideas of like how like I or anyone else on the call could incorporate that into a lesson plan or an assignment, something that we can have them practice?
You know, one of the things that I've seen universities do, all the way to, I've even seen a few what they used to call magnet schools. You know, a very, you know, technically oriented technically oriented schools that, you know, draw from.
I was a product of one of those.
All right, well, I doubt it.
I know what you're talking about. Magnet schools, yep.
Well, and I noticed, for example, what various organizations, these schools will do is they will actually show, here's how a tabletop exercise works. They'll start, you know, for incident response, right? Not only will you learn about the concept, maybe even do a game or two, or some sort of activity or two, but what does it mean to actually do tabletop exercises all the way through to actual incident response drills? You know, those are different things.
Sure.
And those kinds of activities can actually be really exciting. To me, they're analogous to people who teach, to the schools who teach things like technical support. They will actually start up a technical support desk, right? And with tickets, you know, they get an open source ticketing system, and they actually follow that, and they actually do that in a hands-on way, and that is actual experience. And it's the same sort of thing with incident response. They'll use a ticketing system or some sort of alerting system, and they'll bring in and say, well, here's the alert, what's the next step, and then learn from those activities. And so I've seen that work out really quite well.
Right. Yeah, can you expand on the tabletop discussion, and like maybe an example of something that we could add? Like,
Sure.
I know you're just talking about tickets. That's definitely one. Anything else?
I think one of the first things when it comes to tabletop exercise is that, and you have to set up the parameters correctly, because usually you can talk about incident response as one of two things: acute or long-term incident response. Because you have to ask yourself, well, what does an incident look like? The 3 a.m. call, oh, ransomware is taking over the organization, you know, so that's acute.
Yeah.
Long-term incident response is, geez, we have a whole bunch of web servers that have log4j in them. They haven't, you know, that you know, an unpatched, right? You could argue, and I've had many organizations talk to me, you know, people who work in security for a living. They see that as an incident. Even though somebody hasn't exploited it, it's still something that is a long-term problem. How do you resolve either the acute problem or the long-term problem? A tabletop exercise for the long-term problem is, okay, what are the most important elements of the organization that we have to lock down first in order to keep our systems going, keep money coming in, and keep our reputation going? It's those three things.
Yeah.
So it's kind of reputational as part of, but keeping business. What are the core systems that we need to be thinking about? And so you set up a policy. You have to start with a security policy first. Then tabletop exercises implement that policy. And it's based on you can talk about crown jewels if you want. You can talk about the critical resources. So if you are an e-commerce company, your critical resources will actually be a different set of resources than, say, a manufacturing company that has a production line with what's it called, conveyor belts or robots and things like that. So you may not be worried about financial transactions as much as the conveyor belts and things and the supply chain coming into your factory. So you set up a scenario, you set up a security policy, then you go and do the tabletop exercise. And that's literally where people sit around a table and people role play. You have the manager, you have executive management, even a board, but then you have IT folks, security folks, maybe even people representing departments, research, for example. And then you talk about and then you say, well, what do we do next? And if the question becomes, and if all the eyes turn to the IT person, or all, then it's like, well, why are you picking on the IT person if it's the security division that is responsible for the incident response, right? So right away in a tabletop exercise, you can identify, wow, we may have a policy, but we haven't really figured out where to go next with that. And half the time with a tabletop exercise, they'll start getting going and they realize, oh man, we don't even have a security policy to, you can't get AI going. You can't orchestrate. You haven't started at the fundamentals. So I don't know if that helps, David.
Yeah, for sure. And that's interesting too, because I'm thinking like this is definitely blending not just like the technical side, but you're also needing to, think as a business person as well. So you're blending the two.
Absolutely. If the tech folks are going off and doing things like shutting X, Y down and all that without understanding the business reason for it, and even if they're doing the right thing and the business folks aren't aware of what they're doing, see, once again, you're repeating an issue of tech as some sort of mystery box rather than tech as something that you're actually using and understanding. And trust me, that's an endemic, that's a common problem worldwide, not just a US thing. It's not just a Japan thing. It's worldwide.
Right. Yeah. So people who come to those tabletop discussions, maybe we can kind of put them in like a job category. Like, what would you say some of those job categories are from the security realm?
From the security realm, a lot of the job things, and forgive me for talking so long, David. This is fun. Great questions. You keep me going. First of all, incident response, governance. But I think governance, call it GRC, call it what you want. There's that. I think another, in talking about job roles, the idea of the security analyst, the blue teamer, right? That continues to be a big, a major push and a major area of interest in organizations. Pen testers, absolutely, but you have that red team, blue team dynamic. That's very important, with the blue team being the most important. Is that what you're asking about specifically?
Yeah, for sure.
A lot of people think that security is all about forensics. They use that term, forensics. If you want to talk about pure forensics, yeah, there are forensic specialists that work for police departments or the FBI, but that's nowhere near as many as pen testers, and that's nowhere near as many as security analysts. And for people who are less technical and all that, governance people, I know, for example, her name's Julie. She a year and a half ago was teaching elementary students. Okay, and she was teaching elementary students what elementary teachers teach, right? Reading, arithmetic, cultural, how to work and play well with others and all that. She's now a GRC compliance specialist.
Oh, nice.
It took her less than a year. That was a year. It took her less than a year to make a transition from being a school teacher to doing GRC. Is she technical as a security analyst or as a pen tester or a forensic specialist? No, but she's very good at walking into a room and corralling a bunch of unruly people. Right.
Yeah, where did she get that job skill from? Exactly.
One of the things that I would say with whether it be your homeschool students or with your college students or whatever, your previous life experience is seriously important. And leverage that. Don't discount your previous life experience. When I first started making the transition in the 1990s from being a person who did British Romantic literature and wrote dissertations and all that, when I made that transition over to the security world, I got my first pen testing job as a writer of the reports, because they all were like, hey, James, you're going to be coming with us to Hong Kong and Washington, D.C. and London. We hate writing the reports. We love hacking into stuff. You understand what it means to do the security thing, but you're going to be our writer, and then we'll have you help start breaking into stuff. And that was a great way to start.
Right. Yeah. So you can frame your experience, English degree, in such a way to say how it is applicable and important for this cybersecurity position, right?
Absolutely. I'm not saying I'm proud of that English degree at all. I was able to leverage it, right?
Yeah. Well, and then I'm thinking about like students that have, fast food experience because a lot of them have that. Barista. It's like,
Yeah,
how do you frame it in such a way to show that this will help you with the cybersecurity job?
there's no question about that. Uber drivers, for example, I realize young students aren't probably Uber drivers, right? But people will say, well, what does that have to do with security? I'm like, what do you mean? You receive a request, you receive a ticket, you have to, solve a problem. All of these things are areas that if you can see the larger picture, you can reframe, and it's not being deceitful.
Yeah.
It's not exaggeration at all. You're actually saying, I know how to get things done, and that's what we need in the security.
Yeah, and this is what I learned from this job, and this is how I can now use it for this new position.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think Scott points it out, and I suppose we could. I think we're at time,
Yeah.
but
Yep.
the idea is to share real world experience. The more that you can tell some stories, to draw an analogy, and to ask questions of the people. Tell a quick story. Unlike me, I tell long ones. But tell a quick story and then say, "Is that kind of where you're going?" Because I have a couple more things I'd like to talk about. You'll find your students will find that employment scene, getting employed, is a lot less scary than they think.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we are definitely at the top of the hour here now, and I think we could go on and on. So hopefully, maybe we can continue this discussion in another time. But
Happy
I,
to do it.
I'm super happy with how this went, and thank you so much for your time. And everyone that's on the call, thank you for your questions and your time as well. James, this was great. I appreciate it. Let's do this again.
I'm ready to do it again. Folks, you can visit CompTIA.org, of course, NCSL, to learn more about the partnership and moving forward. The better we can prepare people to make that shift into the workplace and to demystify that, the better. So, David, thank you very much for the opportunity to help
You're
you.
welcome. And looking in comments, it looks like lots of people enjoyed this as well. So
Oh,
please,
good. So,
James.
all right. Well, take care, man. All the best, and thanks again.
All right. You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.